I am a police officer working on an emergency response team in a busy London borough. We received a call about a suspected domestic incident in a block of flats. The informant reported hearing screaming and sounds of a disturbance coming from the flat above her own. Upon our arrival, my colleague and I knocked on the door of the flat the informant had identified. I hadn't heard anything on my way up and certainly couldn't hear any disturbance coming from the address. To be honest, I heard nothing at all. After knocking twice with no response, my colleague left to go downstairs and speak directly to the informant. I stayed by the door. I knocked again, and after some time, it was answered by an elderly woman. She had clearly been asleep and was alarmed to see me standing outside. I told her that someone had called, saying they could hear a disturbance coming from her address. I asked if there was anyone else inside with her. She looked bemused and told me that she lived alone and had been sleeping. I asked if I could come in to confirm that no one else was there. She invited me in, and I walked into what was a small two-bedroom flat. The flat was in darkness apart from her hall light and bedside lamp. I began searching through the flat. As I approached the final door, the living room, my colleague called me on the radio. He told me he was on his way and asked if I was okay. I told him everything was fine, wondering why he sounded so flustered. He said he was with the informant and could also hear screaming and loud thuds coming from the flat I was in. I told him he must be mistaken, as I was almost done searching the flat and had heard nothing whatsoever. I have to admit, I felt uneasy as I opened the final door. Like all the other rooms, it was in darkness but was freezing cold. My breath misted immediately. There was no one in the room and no signs of disturbance. No window was open. I called my colleague and asked him to listen for my footfall. He said he could hear my footsteps as I stamped them, but said the screaming had stopped. This coincided with me opening the door. I left shortly after, apologizing to the elderly woman for waking her. I have no rational explanation for this at all. My colleague and I left feeling very creeped out. Late one evening about a decade ago, I responded to a call with additional units in tow. The caller reported hearing footsteps on her second floor while she was in the kitchen. She lived alone, was middle-aged, divorced, had no kids, and no expected company. She was outside across the street when we arrived, obviously unnerved and being calmed by her neighbor. Other units showed up almost as I did and set up a perimeter at the corners of the property. We talked with her, got permission to enter, and decided to announce ourselves and clear the house. 3 of us stacked up at the front door, announced our presence, and made entry while the other officers viewed the windows from a distance under concealment. She was in the midst of making a late dinner, so the house smelled really good. I remember how good it smelled. Anyway, we cleared the ground level and made our way to the stairs when we heard it. Footsteps on the wood floors above us. They weren't panicky, "Oh shit, I'm caught," footsteps running to hide or escape. No, these were calm, methodical, almost like pacing. We announced ourselves again, and there was no response, except the pacing started to fade away. Quietly, I made my way up the steps, adrenaline pumping, concentrating on pieing the corner at the top. I stopped a few stairs shy of the corner, breathed, and proceeded up. The hallway at the top was pitch black. After successfully clearing the top corner, we made our way down the hallway, clearing rooms. Nothing. Nobody. Not even a critter. No critter would ever make what I describe as human footsteps on hardwood. After the initial search, a few other officers also checked every nook and cranny. Beds, closets, racks, even the washer, dryer, appliances, and cupboards were thoroughly searched. Nothing was out of order. Nobody was hiding anywhere. Eventually, we invited the lady back into her residence and reassured her that there was nobody in there. We equated the noise to maybe wood shrinkage or expansion in the home. None of the officers outside saw anyone leave the top or bottom floors or windows. The house showed no indications that anyone had tried to force open a window or door. I stayed behind for about 30 minutes after the other officers cleared the call and waited while her friend showed up to stay the night with her. I went over basic security measures with her and double-checked that all her windows and doors were not compromised. She fed me well-done lasagna as I waited, And to this day, I'm convinced that I interacted with another dimension of life that day. About 4 years ago, a lady who I'll call Lucy called our non-emergency line and said she had locked herself out of her house. I responded to take the report in case the fire department needed to force entry. I arrived first and immediately noticed a burning candle and some Jesus-y statues in the upstairs window. The light in this room was also on. I can't explain it, but it seemed a bit odd to me. Anyway, I approached Lucy, who appeared to be about 65 years old, and asked what happened. She said she had walked to her car to get groceries for her and her mother but forgot her keys inside, and the door had locked behind her. I asked if her mother was home, and Lucy replied affirmatively. She went on to say she technically lived alone because her mom died 6 years prior, but she still lives with her in the bedroom with the lit candle and makes her presence known by turning on off lights, opening/closing doors, and turning on the bathroom faucet. I then walked the perimeter of the home and found an unlocked window into the kitchen. Since Lucy never actually left home and knew no one else was inside, I radioed dispatch and climbed in through the window with her consent. As my boot touched the kitchen floor, I heard an audible click. At the same time, the lights in the stairway and upstairs hallway to my left turned off. I quickly walked to the rear sliding door to my right and advised Lucy what had happened. Lucy laughed and said that was just her mom saying hello. I told Lucy that although I genuinely believed what she told me, I still had to do my due diligence and ensure no one else was inside. I radioed for backup, and within minutes my buddy arrived. The first thing he asked about was the lit candle in the window. While clearing the upstairs, we came upon the room where the candle was and immediately noticed it was blown out. There were no open windows, fans, vents, or other obvious sources that could have extinguished the flame. We just looked at each other with a bit of unease and went back downstairs to leave. Click. The upstairs lights turned off behind us. We talked to Lucy for another 5 minutes and suggested getting a battery-operated candle just to be safe. Well, Lucy clearly thought, fuck the police. Because to this day, that candle burns in the open window most nights when I drive by. And every now and then, I'll stop and talk to Lucy to see how she and her mother are doing. Not really scary, but possibly paranormal, and a case I was never able to solve. 3 years ago, I was called in to investigate a burglary in a cemetery. When the forensics team and I finally arrived, it was a slow morning. None of the responding deputies had actually gone inside yet. For deputies and a sergeant were busy securing the scene from the outside because it was still dark out, and they didn't want to go into the dark mausoleum that had been broken into. Apparently, they felt much safer with us overweight non-sworn employees around, so we went inside together. The exterior door to the mausoleum had been forced open, and we started looking around for signs of anything stolen or vandalized. Eventually, we found that one of the grave sites in the mausoleum, almost 15 feet off the ground, had the cement plaque shattered and the coffin pulled out and left sprawling on the floor. All contents of the coffin were missing, including the cremated remains of 3 people, the last of whom died in 2004. A person would have had to bring their own ladder to pull this out or been at least 12 to 13 feet tall. According to the forensics guy, it looked like the plaque for the coffin had been shattered from the inside due to water damage. Still, it seemed oddly coincidental that a plaque would simultaneously break on the night of a break-in to the mausoleum. It hadn't been accessed since 2004, almost 12 years prior. The people in the gravesite had a single living relative. I called them, exchanged pleasantries, and then when I asked about the mausoleum, they said no habla English and hung up. It's probably drug-related somehow, but this is exactly the kind of thing that would happen at the start of a vampire or zombie apocalypse movie. I was a Metropolitan Police officer serving with the Diplomatic Protection Group during the 80s. One night, I was on duty protecting a government building in Carlton House Terrace in central London. In the early hours of the morning, I decided to take a walk around the outside perimeter to check that all was well. I opened the front door and saw a young boy standing about 12 feet away from me. He was wearing an Edwardian tweed cap, jacket, +4 trousers, and long socks. He was also carrying a heavy, old-style leather football. The property is used a great deal for filming because of its atmospheric nature, Think Sherlock Holmes. I said, "Hello, what are you doing here?" He smiled and bounced the ball, but I realized that the ball made no sound upon striking the ground. Then, I noticed a lady standing behind him. She appeared to be in her late 30s and was wearing a small straw hat with flowers and cherries on it. She had on a long cream cotton dress with leg of mutton sleeves, also Edwardian in style. She beckoned to the boy with her hand to come to her. He smiled at me, waved, and joined the woman. They turned away from me and vanished. I know that I was not dreaming. To confirm my alertness, I requested a signal check on my radio to my control. Perhaps I had experienced a time slip? As a military policeman stationed at Camp Lejeune, I encountered a chilling situation one night. A dispatcher received a call from a terrified wife reporting that kids were trying to get into her house, just after midnight. Initially, we thought it might be a drunken spouse call, but we responded to ensure the woman's safety. Upon arrival, the woman was visibly shaken, with puffy eyes. She recounted how 4 children with red eyes had approached her door, asking to come inside. When she refused, they became angry and terrorized her for about 5 minutes. Her own child was already in bed, and her husband was deployed. Feeling unsettled, my partner and I decided to conduct a thorough check of the housing property. We found nothing unusual. However, as we approached a playground, we saw some kids swinging, despite the curfew being at 8 p.m. for young children unless accompanied by an adult on base. Seeing these children staring at us sent shivers down our spines. We quickly retreated without looking back or discussing it further that night. Later, I researched the incident online and discovered that sightings of little red-eyed kids had been reported before on the base, adding to the eerie atmosphere of Camp Lejeune, known for its paranormal activity. Responding to a call where a woman was being stabbed was one of the most intense experiences of my career. My partner, who was also a good friend, and I were dispatched with minimal information, just a vague mention of a possible domestic disturbance. Upon arriving at the scene, we knocked on the door but received no response. We began checking the windows to see if we could hear anything inside. Despite my partner suggesting it might be a prank call, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Something deep inside me urged me to stay, even though protocol dictated that we couldn't enter the house without more information. After persistently pounding on the door for 15 minutes, a woman suddenly dashed out of the house, covered in stab wounds. Following closely behind her was a man holding 2 bloody knives. We immediately apprehended him. Reflecting on the situation later, it struck me as unusual that we had stayed for so long. Ordinarily, we would have left if there was no response at the door. But that gut feeling, that intuition, compelled us to stay and ultimately prevented a potentially fatal outcome. A few weeks ago, I was dispatched to a 911 call that involved a frantic female screaming at the dispatcher, "She's going to kill me! Come quick! I'm at XXX Street." Naturally, every unit within range of my sector and myself radioed in a response, and we were all hauling ass to get there. Once we arrived, we discovered that the house had been abandoned for some years. So we set up a cordon around it with officers watching all exits, while my shift partner, a female officer, and I announced ourselves and made entry into the residence. We cleared the entire first floor and proceeded to the second. As soon as we reached the top of the stairs, a slight movement spooked us, and both my partner and I immediately raised our weapons toward a room where there was only a noose. We thought we saw a body on it at first glance, but upon closer inspection, there was nothing there. We cleared the rest of the second floor and took a closer look at the noose, noticing some dried blood and what I think was peeled off skin on it from a previous suicide that occurred over a dozen years ago. We thought it might have been recent, but we couldn't be sure at the time. Anyways, immediately after clearing the house, we determined that it was too dead, for lack of a better word, to have been used recently. However, we called in some detectives. Before we left, we all agreed not to mention what had just happened. My service has a policy regarding what could be considered paranormal instances. If something like that happens, you are immediately suspended from duty and must surrender your badge, gun, duty belt, and vest. Then, you're taken on the spot to a psychiatrist or psychologist for a comprehensive evaluation. Needless to say, I immediately informed my supervisor at the end of my shift and underwent the necessary evaluation. Integrity is important. I've driven past that house multiple times in the past weeks, and each time, I've sunk deeper into my seat as I passed it. There's something about it, you could feel that there was something off about it. The city seems to agree with me. As of 3 days ago, the house is the #1 demolition priority in my sector and will be torn down by the end of the month. I'm just not happy that I'll have to go back inside next week to collect anything that might be of interest to both the city and my superiors. Luckily, I won't be going in alone. Also, the female who called 911 was charged with public mischief under the pretext of misuse of 911 and misleading police officers. 911 operator here. I've shared this story before, but the first overdose call I took after finishing my training has stuck with me for a long time. There was a house full of people high as a kite on a whole slew of substances, and one guy overdosed on heroin. They called 911, and I walked them through the steps while my officers and EMS were on the way. During this whole time, I could hear the agonal breathing in the background and everyone else in the room going batshit crazy. Understandably, as their friend was dying in front of them. I was trying to walk them through my emergency medical dispatch steps, but not a single person in the room was coherent or calm enough to be of any help. They even lied about what he was overdosing on, which made it take more time for Narcan to be administered since my officers didn't know it was heroin until a few minutes after they arrived. The subject lived, so it all turned out well. The next one is newer, just a few months ago. I took a rape call, and that one was the toughest emotionally so far. A young girl, I think she was 20, called in and was just broken on the phone. She wasn't crying anymore, but you could tell she had been. The poor girl had been out for a run on our trails when some guy jumped out, pinned her down, and raped her. As if that wasn't bad enough, she was a virgin. Fortunately, we ended up catching the guy about a month later. Investigative work takes forever, but my detectives combed through thousands of hours of video footage to find his home and ID him. I worked at the Naval Hospital in Camp Pendleton in 2013. I was part of the transition team that moved the last of the belongings that they wanted from the old location to the new one. Along with others on my team, we were part of the final sweep, which included cleaning up, waxing the floors, and locking up some of the higher-level rooms within the old hospital. It was a nice gig because there were a ton of office supplies that were just going to be thrown away, along with some office chairs. I like to draw, so I took home 2 chairs, one for me and one for my roommate, along with a plethora of pens and paper. In my duty section, there was also the security role of watching over the barracks that were just outside the hospital. With the Navy being the Navy, they didn't transfer anyone over to the new barracks until about 8 months after the move to the new hospital. So someone still had to stand duty there and patrol the old hospital to keep away any would-be vandals from a place they thought was completely abandoned. Of course, I ended up getting duty one day and started getting people coming into the commons area telling me to go look at the hospital. There was very clearly a light on in the 6th or 7th floor with a figure standing motionless watching outside. I put up a sign saying that I would be leaving the office and to call my personal number should they need anything. Usually, it was just to reset their key cards, but each room had 4 rooms within it, so usually, people just called their roommates to open the doors instead of waiting for the process of me resetting their key card. It was already pretty late at night, so I wasn't worried about it. I went to the hospital, and it was still completely locked all around. I checked to make sure that no windows were ajar, but the hospital didn't have any that opened. I even tried to lift the back hatch that linens and new supplies came through by truck, and that was still secured. I had no other way of getting in myself, so when my chief came down around 2 a.m., as they seldomly did but were required to at least once a night, I made a report of it. By this time, the figure was gone, but the light remained on. I was never told if they ever found anyone or if it was even followed up on for that matter. But it was one of the creepiest things I remember from being there.